Part 1. On the Prejudices of Philosophers. The will to truth, which is still going to tempt us to many a hazardous enterprise, that celebrated veracity of which all philosophers have hitherto spoken with reverence. What questions this will to truth has already set before us. What strange, wicked, questionable questions. It is already a long story, yet does it not seem as if it has only just begun? Is it any wonder we should at last grow distrustful, lose our patience, turn impatiently away? That this Sphinx should teach us too to ask questions. Who really is it that here questions us? What really is it in us that wants the truth? We did indeed pause for a long time before the question of the origin of this will, until finally we came to a complete halt before an even more fundamental question. We asked after the value of this will. Granted we want truth, why not rather untruth? And uncertainty, even ignorance. The problem of the value of truth stepped before us, or was it we who stepped before this problem? Which of us is Oedipus here? Which of us Sphinx? It is, it seems, a rendezvous of questions and question marks. And, would you believe it, it has finally almost come to seem to us that this problem has never before been posed, that we have been the first to see it, to fix our eye on it, to hazard it. For there is a hazard in it, and perhaps there exists no greater hazard. How could something originate in its antithesis? Truth in error, for example. Or will to truth in will to deception. Or the unselfish act in self-interest. Or the pure, radiant gaze of the sage in covetousness. Such origination is impossible. He who dreams of it is a fool, indeed worse than a fool. The things of the highest value must have another origin of their own. They cannot be derivable from this transitory, seductive, deceptive, mean little world, from this confusion of desire and illusion. In the womb of being, rather, in the intransitory, in the hidden God, in the thing in itself, that is where their cause must lie and nowhere else. This mode of judgment constitutes the typical prejudice by which metaphysicians of all ages can be recognized. This mode of evaluation stands in T. The fundamental faith of the metaphysicians is the faith in antithetical values. It has not occurred to even the most cautious of them to pause and doubt here on the threshold, where however it was most needful they should, even if they had vowed to themselves, de omnibus dubitandum. For it may be doubted, firstly whether there exist any antitheses at all, and secondly whether these popular evaluations and value antitheses, on which the metaphysicians have set their seal, are not perhaps merely foreground valuations, merely provisional perspectives, perhaps moreover the prospect. With all the value that may adhere to the true, the genuine, the selfless, it could be possible that a higher and more fundamental value for all life might have to be ascribed to appearance, to the will to deception, to selfishness, and to appetite. It might even be possible that what constitutes the value of those good and honored things resides precisely in their being artfully related, knotted and crocheted to these wicked, apparently antithetical things, perhaps even in their being essentially identical with them. Perhaps. But who is willing to concern himself with such dangerous perhapses? For that we have to await the arrival of a new species of philosopher, one which possesses tastes and inclinations opposite to and different from those of its predecessors, philosophers of the dangerous, perhaps, in every sense. And to speak in all seriousness, I see such new philosophers arising. Having kept a close eye on philosophers and read between their lines for a sufficient length of time, I tell myself, the greater part of conscious thinking must still be counted among the instinctive activities, and this is so even in the case of philosophical thinking. We have to learn differently. Just as the act of being born plays no part in the procedure and progress of heredity, so being conscious is in no decisive sense the opposite of the instinctive. Most of a philosopher's conscious thinking is secretly directed and compelled into definite channels by his instincts. Behind all logic, too, and its apparent autonomy, there stand evaluations, in plainer terms physiological demands for the preservation of a certain species of life. For example, that the definite shall be of greater value than the indefinite, appearance of less value than truth. But such valuations as these could, their regulatory importance for us notwithstanding, be no more than foreground valuations, a certain species of niaisery which may be necessary PR. Assuming, that is to say, that it is not precisely man who is the measure of things. The falseness of a judgment is to us not necessarily an objection to a judgment. It is here that our new language perhaps sounds strangest. The question is to what extent it is life-advancing, life-preserving, species-preserving, perhaps even species-breeding. And our fundamental tendency is to assert that the falsest judgments, to which synthetic judgments a priori belong, are the most indispensable to us, that without granting as TR. To recognize untruth as a condition of life. That, to be sure, means to resist customary value sentiments in a dangerous fashion, and a philosophy which ventures to do so places itself, by that act alone, beyond good and evil. What makes one regard philosophers half mistrustfully and half mockingly is not that one again and again detects how innocent they are, how often and how easily they fall into error and go astray, in short their childishness and childlikeness, but that they display altogether insufficient honesty. They pose as having discovered and attained their real opinions through the self-evolution of a cold, pure, divinely unperturbed dialectic, in contrast to the mystics of every rank, who are more honest and more stupid than they. These speak of inspiration, while what happens at bottom is that the tartuffery, as stiff as it is virtuous, of old Kant, as he lures us along the dialectical bypaths which lead, more correctly, mislead, to his categorical imperative. This spectacle makes us smile, we who are fastidious and find no little amusement in observing the subtle tricks of old moralist. Not to speak of that hocus-pocus of mathematical form in which, as if in iron, Spinoza encased and masked his philosophy, the love of his wisdom, to render that word fairly and squarely, so as to strike terror into the heart of any assailant who should dare to glance at that invincible maiden. And it has gradually become clear to me what every great philosophy has hitherto been, a confession on the part of its author, and a kind of involuntary and unconscious memoir. Moreover, that the moral or immoral intentions in every philosophy have every time constituted the real germ of life out of W.H. To explain how a philosopher's most remote metaphysical assertions have actually been arrived at, it is always well and wise to ask oneself first, what morality does he aim at? I accordingly do not believe a drive to knowledge to be the father of philosophy, but that another drive has, here as elsewhere, only employed knowledge and false knowledge as a tool. But anyone who looks at the basic drives of mankind to see to what extent they may, in precisely this connection, have come into play as inspirational spirits, or demons and kobolds, will discover that they have all at some time or other practiced philosophy, and that each one of them would be anal. For every drive is tyrannical, and it is as such that it tries to philosophize. In the case of scholars, to be sure, in the case of really scientific men, things may be different, better. If you will, there may really exist something like a drive to knowledge there, some little independent clockwork which, when wound up, works bravely on without any of the scholar's other. The scholar's real interests therefore generally lie in quite another direction, perhaps in his family, or in making money, or in politics. It is, indeed, almost a matter of indifference whether his little machine is set up in this region of science or that, whether the promising young worker make. In the philosopher, on the contrary, there is nothing whatever impersonal, and above all, his morality bears decided and decisive testimony to who he is. That is to say, to the order of rank the innermost drives of his nature stand in relative to one another. How malicious philosophers can be. I know of nothing more venomous than the joke Epicurus allowed himself to make against Plato and the Platonists. He called them Dionysiacal. The literal and foreground meaning of this word is flatterers of Dionysus, that is to say, tyrants, hangers-on, and lickspittles. In addition, however, it is as much as to say, they are all actors, there is nothing genuine about them. For Dionysiacal acts was a popular term for an actor. And the latter meaning is really the piece of malice that Epicurus discharged at Plato. He was annoyed by the grandiose manner, the mise-en-scene of which Plato and his pupils were masters, of which Epicurus was not a master. He, the old schoolteacher from Samos, who sat hidden in his little garden at Athens and wrote 300 books. Who knows, perhaps out of rage at Plato and ambitious envy of him. It took a century for Greece to find out who this garden god Epicurus had been. Did it find out? In every philosophy there is a point at which the philosopher's conviction appears on the scene, or, to put it in the words of an ancient mystery, adventavit asinus, pulcher et fortissimus. You want to live according to nature. Oh, you noble Stoics, what fraudulent words. Think of a being such as nature is, prodigal beyond measure, indifferent beyond measure, without aims or intentions, without mercy or justice, at once fruitful and barren and uncertain. Think of indifference itself as a power. How could you live according to such indifference? To live, is that not precisely wanting to be other than this nature? Is living not valuating, preferring, being unjust, being limited, wanting to be different? And even if your imperative, live according to nature, meant at bottom the same thing as live according to life, how could you not do that? Why make a principle of what you yourselves are and must be? The truth of it is, however, quite different. While you rapturously pose as deriving the canon of your law from nature, you want something quite the reverse of that, you strange actors and self-deceivers. Your pride wants to prescribe your morality, your ideal, to nature, yes, to nature itself, and incorporate them in it. You demand that nature should be nature, according to the Stoa, and would like to make all existence exist only after your own image, as a tremendous eternal glorification and unive. All your love of truth notwithstanding, you have compelled yourselves for so long and with such persistence and hypnotic rigidity to view nature falsely, namely stoically. You are no longer capable of viewing it in any other way, and some abysmal arrogance infects you at last with the bedlamite hop. But this is an old and never-ending story. What formerly happened with the Stoics still happens today as soon as a philosophy begins to believe in itself. It always creates the world in its own image. It cannot do otherwise. Philosophy is this tyrannical drive itself, the most spiritual will to power, to creation of the world, to causa prima. The zeal and subtlety, I might even say slyness, with which the problem of the real and apparent world is set upon all over Europe today makes one think hard and prick up one's ears. And anyone who hears in the background only a will to truth, and nothing more, certainly does not enjoy the best o. In rare and isolated cases, such a will to truth, some extravagant and adventurous courage, a metaphysician's ambition to maintain a forlorn position, may actually play a part and finally prefer a handful of certainty to a whole cartful of beautiful possibilities. There may even exist puritanical F. But this is nihilism, and the sign of a despairing, mortally weary soul, however brave the bearing of such a virtue may appear. In the case of stronger, livelier thinkers who are still thirsty for life, however, it seems to be different. When they take sides against appearance and speak even of perspective, with an arrogant disdain, when they rank the credibility of their own body about as low as the credibility of the occult. There is distrust of these modern ideas in this outlook. There is disbelief in all that has been constructed yesterday and today. There is perhaps in addition a little boredom and mockery which can no longer endure the bric-a-brac of concepts of the most various origin, such as so-called positivism be. In this, it seems to me, we ought to acknowledge that these skeptical anti-realists and knowledge microscopists of today are in the right. The instinct which makes them recoil from modern reality stands unrefuted. What do we care about the retrograde bypaths they choose? The essential thing about them is not that they want to go back, but that they want to get away. A little strength, soaring, courage, artistic power more, and they would want to go up and away and not back. It seems to me that there is today an effort going on everywhere to distract attention from the actual influence exercised on German philosophy by Kant, and, in particular, prudently to gloss over the value he set upon himself. Kant was first and foremost proud of his table of categories. With this table in his hand, he said, This is the hardest thing that could ever be undertaken on behalf of metaphysics. But let us understand this could be. He was proud of having discovered a new faculty in man, the faculty of synthetic judgments a priori. Granted, he deceived himself in this. The evolution and rapid burgeoning of German philosophy none the less depended on this pride of his and on the eager rivalry of the whole younger generation to discover, if possible, something of which to be still prouder, and in any event new faculties. But let us stop and reflect. It is time we did so. Kant asked himself, how are synthetic judgments a priori possible? And what, really, did he answer? By means of a faculty, but unfortunately not in a few words, but so circumspectly, venerably, and with such an expenditure of German profundity and flourishes that the comical niaiserie allemande involved in such an answer was overlooked. People even lost their heads altogether on account of this new faculty, and the rejoicing reached its climax when Kant went on further to discover a moral faculty in man. For at that time the Germans were still moral and by no means practitioners of realpolitik. The honeymoon time of German philosophy arrived, and the young theologians of the College of Tübingen went straightway off into the bushes, all in search of faculties. And what did they not find in that innocent, rich, still youthful era of the German spirit, to which the malicious fairy, Romanticism, piped and sang, in those days when one was not yet able to distinguish between finding and inventing? They found above all a faculty for the supersensible. Schelling baptized it intellectual intuition, and therewith satisfied the most heartfelt longings of his Germans, which longings were fundamentally pious. One can do no greater wrong to this whole high-spirited and enthusiastic movement, which was really youthfulness however boldly it disguised itself in hoary and senile concepts, than to take it seriously, and even worse injustice, to treat it with moral indignation. It is enough to say that a time came when one rubbed one's eyes. One is still rubbing them today. One had been dreaming, and the first and foremost of the dreamers was old Kant. By means of a faculty, he had said, or at least meant. But is that an answer? An explanation? Or is it not rather merely a repetition of the question? How does opium induce sleep? By means of a faculty, namely the virtus dormitiva, replies the doctor in Molière, quia est in eo virtus dormitiva, cujus est natura sensus assupaer. But answers like that belong in comedy, and it is high time to replace the Kantian question, how are synthetic judgments a priori possible, with another question, why is belief in such judgments necessary? That is to say, it is time to grasp that, for the purpose of preserving beings such as, or more clearly, crudely and basically, synthetic judgments a priori should not be possible at all. We have no right to them. In our mouths they are nothing but false judgments. But belief in their truth is, of course, necessary as foreground belief and ocular evidence belonging to the perspective optics of life. Finally, in considering the enormous influence German philosophy, I hope you understand its right to inverted commas, has exercised throughout Europe, one cannot doubt that a certain virtus dormitiva has played a part in it. The noble idlers, the virtuous, the mystics, the artists, the three-quarter Christians, and the political obscurantists of all nations were delighted to possess, thanks to German philosophy, and as for materialistic atomism, it is one of the best refuted things there are, and perhaps no scholar in Europe is still so unscholarly today as to accord it serious significance except for handy everyday use, as an abbreviated means of expression. Thanks above all to the Pole Byscovich who, tojeth. For while Copernicus persuaded us to believe, contrary to all the senses, that the earth does not stand firm, Byscovich taught us to abjure belief in the last thing of earth that stood firm, belief in substance, in matter, in the earth residuum and particle atom. It was the greatest triumph of. One must, however, go still further and also declare war, a remorseless war of the knife, on the atomistic need, which, like that more famous metaphysical need, still goes on living a dangerous afterlife in regions where no one suspects it. One must also first of all finish off that other end. Let this expression be allowed to designate that belief which regards the soul as being something indestructible, eternal, indivisible, as a monad, as an atomen. This belief ought to be ejected from science. Between ourselves, it is not at all necessary by that same act to get rid of the soul itself, and thus forego one of the oldest and most venerable of hypotheses, as is often the way with clumsy naturalists, who can hardly touch the soul without losing it. But the road to new forms and refinements of the soul hypothesis stands open, and such conceptions as mortal soul and soul as multiplicity of the subject, and soul as social structure of the drives and emotions want henceforth to possess civic rights in science. To be sure, when the new psychologist puts an end to the superstition which has hitherto flourished around the soul idea with almost tropical luxuriance, he has as it were thrust himself out into a new wilderness, and a new mistrust, it may be, that the older psychologists had a merrier and more comf. Perhaps to finding it. Physiologists should think again before postulating the drive to self-preservation as the cardinal drive in an organic being. A living thing desires above all to vent its strength life, as such is will to power. Self-preservation is only one of the indirect and most frequent consequences of it. In short, here as everywhere, beware of superfluous teleological principles. Such as is the drive to self-preservation, we owe it to Spinoza's inconsistency. For this is a requirement of method, which has essentially to be economy of principles. It is perhaps just dawning on 5 or 6 minds that physics too is only an interpretation and arrangement of the world, according to our own requirements, if I may say so, and not an explanation of the world, but in so far as it is founded on belief in the senses, it passes for more than that an M. It has the eyes and the hands on its side. It has ocular evidence and palpability on its side. And this has the effect of fascinating, persuading, convincing an age with fundamentally plebeian tastes, for it instinctively follows the canon of eternal, popular sensualism. What is obvious, what has been explained? Only that which can be seen and felt. Thus far has every problem to be scrutinized. Obversely, it was precisely in opposition to palpability that the charm of the Platonic mode of thinking, which was a noble mode of thinking, consisted, on the part of men who perhaps rejoiced in even stronger and more exacting senses than our contemporaries possess, but who knew how to experience. This overcoming and interpretation of the world in the manner of Plato involved a kind of enjoyment different from that which the physicists of today offer us, or from that offered us by the Darwinists and anti-teleologists among the laborers in physiology, with their principle of the smallest pose. Where man has nothing more to see or grasp, he has nothing more to do. That is certainly a different imperative from the Platonic. But for an uncouth, industrious race of machinists and bridge builders of the future, which has nothing but coarse work to get through, it may well be the right one. If one is to pursue physiology with a good conscience, one is compelled to insist that the organs of sense are not phenomena in the sense of idealist philosophy, for if they were, they could not be causes. Sensualism, therefore, is at least a regulative hypothesis, certainly a heuristic principle. What? And others even go so far as to say that the external world is the work of our organs. But then our body, as a piece of this external world, would be the work of our organs. But then our organs themselves would be the work of our organs. This, it seems to me, is a complete reductio ad absurdum, supposing that the concept causa sui is something altogether absurd. Consequently, the external world is not the work of our organs. There are still harmless self-observers who believe immediate certainties exist, for example, I think, or as with Schopenhauer's superstition, I will, as though knowledge here got hold of its object pure and naked, as thing in itself, and no falsification occurred either on the side of the sub. But I shall reiterate 100 times that immediate certainty, like absolute knowledge and thing in itself, contains a contradictio in adjecto. We really ought to get free from the seduction of words. Let the people believe that knowledge is total knowledge, but the philosopher must say to himself, when I analyze the event expressed in the sentence, I think, I acquire a series of rash assertions which are difficult, perhaps impossible, to prove, for example, that it is I who think that it has. For if I had not already decided that matter within myself, by what standard could I determine that what is happening is not perhaps willing or feeling? Enough, this, I think, presupposes that I compare my present state with other known states of myself in order to determine what it is. On account of this retrospective connection with other knowledge, at any rate it possesses no immediate certainty for me. In place of that immediate certainty, in which the people may believe in the present case, the philosopher acquires in this way a series of metaphysical questions, true questions of conscience for the intellect, namely, whence do I take the concept thinking? Why do I believe in cause and effect? What gives me the right to speak of an I, and even of an I as cause, and finally of an I as cause of thought? Whoever feels able to answer these metaphysical questions straight away with an appeal to a sort of intuitive knowledge, as he does who says, I think, and know that this at least is. My dear sir, the philosopher will perhaps give him to understand, it is improbable you are not mistaken, but why do you want the truth at all? As for the superstitions of the logicians, I shall never tire of underlining a concise little fact which these superstitious people are loath to admit. It thinks, but that it is precisely that famous old I is, to put it mildly, only an assumption, an assertion, above all not an immediate certainty. For even with this, it thinks one has already gone too far. It already contains an interpretation of the event and does not belong to the event itself. The inference here is in accordance with the habit of grammar. Thinking is an activity, to every activity pertains one who acts, consequently. It was more or less in accordance with the same scheme that the older atomism sought, in addition to the force which acts, that little lump of matter in which it resides, out of which it acts, the atom. More rigorous minds at last learned to get along without this residuum of earth, and perhaps it is certainly not the least charm of a theory that it is refutable. It is with precisely this charm that it entices subtler minds. It seems that the 100 times refuted theory of free will owes its continued existence to this charm alone. Again and again, there comes along someone who feels he is strong enough to refute it. Philosophers are given to speaking of the will as if it were the best known thing in the world. Schopenhauer, indeed, would have us understand that the will alone is truly known to us, known completely, known without deduction or addition. But it seems to me that in this case, too, Schopenhauer has done only what philosophers in general are given to doing, that he has taken up a popular prejudice and exaggerated it. Willing seems to me to be above all something complicated, something that is a unity only as a word. And it is precisely in this one word that the popular prejudice resides, which has overborne the always inadequate caution of the philosophers. Let us therefore be more cautious for once. Let us be unphilosophical. Let us say, in all willing there is, first of all, a plurality of sensations, namely the sensation of the condition we leave, the sensation of the condition towards which we go, the sensation of this leaving and going itsy. As feelings, and indeed many varieties of feeling, can therefore be recognized as an ingredient of will, so, in the second place, can thinking. In every act of will there is a commanding thought, and do not imagine that this thought can be separated from the willing, as though will would then rem. Thirdly, will is not only a complex of feeling and thinking, but above all an affect, and in fact the affect of command. What is called freedom of will is essentially the affect of superiority over him who must obey. I am free. He must obey. This consciousness adheres to every will, as does that tense attention, that straight look which fixes itself exclusively on one thing, that unconditional evaluation, this. A man who wills commands something in himself which obeys, or which he believes obeys. But now observe the strangest thing of all about the will, about this so complex thing for which people have only one word. Inasmuch as in the given circumstances we at the same time command and obey, and as the side which obeys know the sensations of constraint, compulsion, pressure, resistance, because in the great majority of cases willing takes place only where the effect of the command, that is to say obedience, that is to say the action, was to be expected, the appearance has translated itself into the sensation, as if there were here a necessity of effect. Enough, he who wills believes with a tolerable degree of certainty that will and action are somehow one. He attributes the success, the carrying out of the willing, to the will itself, and thereby enjoys an increase of that sensation of power which all success brings with it. Freedom of will is the expression for that complex condition of pleasure of the person who wills, who commands, and at the same time identifies himself with the executor of the command, who as such also enjoys the triumph over resistances involved, but who thinks it was his will itself which over. He who wills adds in this way the sensations of pleasure of the successful executive agents. The serviceable underwills or undersouls for our body is only a social structure composed of many souls, to his sensations of pleasure as commander. Elle fait, c'est moi. What happens here is what happens in every well-constructed and happy commonwealth. The ruling class identifies itself with the successes of the commonwealth. In all willing, it is absolutely a question of commanding and obeying, on the basis, as I have said already, of a social structure composed of many souls, on which account a philosopher should claim the right to include willing as such within the field of morality, that is, of morality understood. That individual philosophical concepts are not something arbitrary, something growing up autonomously, but on the contrary grow up connected and related to one another. That, however suddenly and arbitrarily they appear to emerge in the history of thought, they none the less belong just as much to. Under an invisible spell, they always trace once more the identical orbit. However independent of one another they may feel, with their will to criticism or systematism, something in them leads them, something drives them in a definite order one after another. It is precisely that innate systematism. Their thinking is in fact not so much a discovering as a recognizing, a remembering, a return and homecoming to a far-off, primordial total household of the soul out of which those concepts once emerged philosophizing, is to that extent a species of atavism of the first rank. The singular family resemblance between all Indian, Greek, and German philosophizing is easy enough to explain. Where there exists a language affinity, it is quite impossible, thanks to the common philosophy of grammar. I mean thanks to unconscious domination and directing by similar grammatical functions, to avoid everything being prepared in advance for a similar evolution and succession of philosophical philosophers within the domain of the Uralo-Altaic languages, in which the concept of the subject is least developed, will in all probability look into the world differently and be found on different paths from the Indo-Germans and Moslems. The spell of definite grammatical functions is in the last. So much by way of retort to Locke's superficiality with regard to the origin of ideas. The causa sui is the best self-contradiction hitherto imagined, a kind of logical rape and unnaturalness. But mankind's extravagant pride has managed to get itself deeply and frightfully entangled with precisely this piece of nonsense. For the desire for freedom of will, in that metaphysical superlative sense which is unfortunately still dominant in the minds of the half-educated, the desire to bear the whole and sole responsibility for one's actions, and to absolve God, world, ancestors, chance, society from responsibility for assuming it is possible in this way to get beyond the peasant simplicity of this celebrated concept, free will, and banish it from one's mind, I would then ask whoever does that to carry his enlightenment a step further and also banish from his mind the contrary of that unnatural concept, free will. One ought not to make cause and effect into material things, as natural scientists do, and those who, like them, naturalize in their thinking, in accordance with the prevailing mechanistic stupidity which has the cause press and push until it produces an effect. One ought to employ cause. In the in itself, there is nothing of causal connection, of necessity, of psychological unfreedom. There the effect does not follow the cause, there no law rules. It is we alone who have fabricated causes, succession, reciprocity, relativity, compulsion, number, law, freedom, motive, purpose. And when we falsely introduce this world of symbols into things and mingle it with them as though this symbol world were an in itself, we once more behave as we have a unfree will is mythology. In real life, it is only a question of strong and weak wills. It is almost always a symptom of what is lacking in himself when a thinker detects in every causal connection and psychological necessity something of compulsion, exigency, constraint, pressure, unfreedom. Such feelings are traitors. The person who has them gives himself away. And if I have observed correctly, unfreedom of will is in general conceived as a problem from two completely antithetical standpoints, but always in a profoundly personal manner. One will at no price give up his responsibility, his belief in himself, the personal right to his deserts. The vain are. This latter, when he writes books, tends today to espouse the cause of the criminal. His most pleasing disguise is a kind of socialist sympathy. And the fatalism of the weak-willed is indeed beautified to an astonishing degree when it can present itself as la religion de la souffrance humaine. That is its good taste. You must pardon me as an old philologist who cannot refrain from the maliciousness of putting his finger on bad arts of interpretation. But nature's conformity to law of which you physicists speak so proudly, as though it exists only thanks to your interpretation and bad philology. It is not. Everywhere equality before the law nature is in this matter no different from us, and no better off than we. A nice piece of mental reservation in which vulgar hostility towards everything privileged and autocratic, as well as a second and more subtle atheism, lie once more disguised. Nie Dieu, nie Mater, that is your motto too, and therefore long live the law of nature. Isn't that so? But as aforesaid, that is interpretation, not text, and someone could come along who, with an opposite intention and art of interpretation, knew how to read out of the same nature, and with regard to the same phenomena the tyrannically ruthless and inexorable enforcement of power demands. An interp. Granted, this too is only interpretation, and you will be eager enough to raise this objection. Well, so much the better. All psychology has hitherto remained anchored to moral prejudices and timidities. It has not ventured into the depths. To conceive it as morphology and the development theory of the will to power, as I conceive it, has never yet so much as entered the mind of anyone else. In so far as it is permissible to see in what has hitherto been written a symptom of what has hitherto been kept silent. The power of moral prejudices has penetrated deep into the most spiritual world, which is apparently the coldest and most free of presuppositions, and, as goes without saying, has there acted in a harmful, inhibiting, blinding, distorting fashion. A genuine physiopsychology has to struggle with unconscious resistances in the heart of the investigator. It has the heart against it. Even a theory of the mutual dependence of the good and the wicked impulses causes, as a more refined immorality, revulsion to a conscience still strong and Supposing, however, that someone goes so far as to regard the emotions of hatred, envy, covetousness, and lust for domination as life-conditioning emotions, as something which must fundamentally and essentially be present in the total economy of life, consequently must be heightened further if life. And yet even this hypothesis is far from being the strangest and most painful in this tremendous, still almost unexplored realm of dangerous knowledge, and there are in fact 100 good reasons why everyone should keep away from it who can. On the other hand, if your ship has been driven into these seas, very well. Now clench your teeth. Keep your eyes open. Keep a firm hand on the helm. We sail straight over morality and past it. We flatten. We crush perhaps what is left of our own morality by venturing to voyage thither. But what do we matter? Never yet has a deeper world of insight revealed itself to daring travelers and adventurers, and the psychologist who, in this fashion, brings a sacrifice. It is not the sacrificio dell'intelletto, on the contrary. Will at least be entitled to demand in return that psychology shall again be recognized as the queen of the sciences, to serve and prepare for which the other sciences exist. For psychology is now once again the road to the fundamental problems.